All right. How's everybody this morning? We are in Acts chapter 25. Acts chapter 25. Got down to about verse 12. Finished up verse 12. So Paul is now standing before, as we saw at the last chapter, he's standing before Festus. And Festus doesn't know what to do with Paul. And again, he is letting the Jews dictate what he does. And we get to and Paul notices that, and we get to verse 11 and 12. Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. And him as a Roman citizen had the right to do that. As we looked at, he had the right to do that before he got judgment. During the trial, he could stop and say, I appeal to Caesar, and the governor or the one that is over the trial would have to allow him to do that, even before judgment. And so that's what Paul did, noticing that he was probably not going to get a good trial there because, of course, Festus, as Felix was held to what the Jews wanted and wanted to be pleasing to them. And so we get down to verse 12, or verse 13. We now are introduced to King Agrippa and Bernice. So somebody want to read verse 13 through 21.
And after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. When they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders and the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered, It is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Therefore, when they had come together without delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about certain Jews who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar.
All right, so we're introduced to King Agrippa and Bernice. Now, a little bit of history on both, which I think is important. Agrippa was the son of a Herod Agrippa. That was in Acts chapter 12. Now, what do we remember about Herod in Acts chapter 12? What happened to him? He was the one eaten by worms. So, it was believed that Agrippa was extremely young when his father died, and so that he then would take over his father's realm and replace him. And it was stated, different historians saying that he was so young that the Caesar did not want to give him all that power at that age. So he gave him a little bit and then increased it into the point where he is now and later on. And so he is the son of Herod Agrippa, and he's also the great grandson of Herod the Great. Now, who is Herod the Great? Herod the Great was the one who, if I remember right, was the one who set the order against Christ and the killing of the children when they were two and under. And so his mother's name was Cyprus. And so after the death of Claudius, Nero, his successor, added to his dominions Julius and Perea and a part of Galilee. Agrippa had been brought up in Rome, was strongly attached to the Romans. When the troubles commenced in Judea, which ended in the destruction of Jerusalem, so that'd be about AD 70, he did all that he could to preserve peace and order, but in vain. He afterward joined his troops with those of the Romans and assisted them in the destruction of Jerusalem. After the captivity of that city, he went to Rome with his sister Bernice, where he ended his days. He died at the age of 70 years, about 90 A.D. His manner of living with his sister gave accusations to reports respecting him a very little to his advantage. And so Agrippa was one that embraced the Jewish faith. So that's important as we start, because Paul will say in chapter 26, I understand that you know a lot about the Jewish faith, and that you are well conversed in the law. Well, the reason is because he was one that accepted the Jew and followed, in a sense, of a proselyte. And so he knows the Jewish religion, he knows all the laws, knows everything about it. And so that's going to be good for Paul because of how he can address him. And we'll talk about that more in chapter 26. He ruled over most of Palestine. And so there's really an overlap of looking at the governor versus the king. And it's believed that Agrippa was higher than Festus. Festus was the governor of Judea. The king Agrippa was over that whole area and more. But it's just interesting to see the difference or the comparisons there in their area, because they're in Caesarea. Caesarea is a part of Palestine. And so, interesting. But Acts chapter 12, as I mentioned, 21 through 23 is when Herod, his father, died in this same city. Think about that. It was Caesarea where Herod was eaten by worms, his father. Now he's back in Caesarea where his father died. And so just interesting. Now Bernice, as it was stated, she was the sister of Agrippa. So there's a lot of different commentators, not different commentators, but writers during that time, like Josephus and many others, that wrote about their situation. She had been married to Herod, king of Challis, her own uncle by her father's side. She was married to him before she was 20, and she was married to another person before that. So she, as we saw with Drusilla, she had been married several different times. Same was with Bernice. She had been married at least twice before the age of 20. And then one of them was her uncle. And then after his death, she proposed to Ptolemy, king of Pontus, and part of Cilicia, that is, if he would circumcise, she would marry him. He complied, but she did not continue long with him, so she wasn't married to him very long. After she left him, she returned to her brother Agrippa, with whom she lived in a manner such as excites scandal. Josephus directly charges her with incest with her brother. And so she would go back and forth. She would go marry someone and come back to her brother. And so it's when we look at Agrippa and Bernice here, they're siblings. They're not king and queen. And which is interesting because she is also knows some about the Jewish faith. And so that's some history between, as we look here, because a lot of times when we go to this, we say, Agrippa and Bernice, they're king and queen. That's not the case. And she tried to do some things to offset the scandal and the rumors, but it's continued for their whole life. And so verse 13 says that Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix. And so here he then gives a very detailed account of what had happened. From verse 14 through verse 21, I'm not going to reread all of that, but he recounts the events that had happened very accurately. Tells him about how he had brought Paul into his custody and how he had the accusers come up. He thought that it was not right. Verse 16, for a man to be judged without his accusers being face to face, so he requested that the Jews come up to Caesarea to stand in front of Paul. They did that. Then he said that he was going to take Paul back to Jerusalem, and as we talked about last week, he asked Paul that. Would you be willing to go back to Jerusalem and be judged in front of him and the chief priest, which would be the Sanhedrin? Paul wisely said no, because if he had gone back to Jerusalem, what would have happened? He would have died, which we know, according to what we saw in the first part of the chapter, those that wanted Paul to come back to Jerusalem, their whole purpose of asking that was to kill Paul. They were going to jump Paul on his way back. And so Festus didn't know that from what we can tell, and so he was being deceived again by them. And so he gives a good, accurate account of those events all the way down to verse 21. And so then verse 22 says, Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. And so Agrippa wants to hear Paul. Festus tells him the next day he will. So verse 23, so the next day when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus' command, Paul was brought in. So Bernice and Agrippa, they come to this auditorium, and it says they come with great pomp. This word is not used anywhere else in the New Testament. It's the only time this word is used, which is interesting. The word pomp means a vain show. And it's a showy appearance. So Festus is the one that did this. He put on this showy appearance, this grand, vain, in a sense, show for them as they come down to this auditorium. The word auditorium means a place of hearing. I think King James says that, place of hearing. Why do you think Festus did that? Remember we talked about last week, did Festus have anything to write to Caesar about what Paul had done? Was he trying to take the load off of himself and put it on someone else? That's exactly what he's doing. So now he is really buttering up Agrippa. And we're going to see the last part of this chapter. That's exactly what's going on. He's buttering Agrippa up. He's trying to place him, really, it's his spot as governor to sit upon this seat of judgment. But he is trying to butter Agrippa up to get him to really write the letter for him. And so notice verse 24. It says, And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all the men who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. So he's starting this discourse about Paul, gives a little introduction about Paul, and he says that these men from Jerusalem, they're crying out that he's not fit to live, which we know that. They want him dead. So verse 25 says, But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. There it is. I don't have anything to say. I don't know what to write. And continue on, verse 26. Therefore I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not specify the charges against him. So he doesn't want to look like a fool by sending Paul as a prisoner all the way to Caesar, which it's kind of like your local courts and the Supreme Court. And so you're trying to take a matter that should have been dealt with in this trial at a local situation, local place, and saying, you know what, I'm going to move him all the way to the Supreme Court, but we don't have any charges. How embarrassing would that have been for a lawyer to do? Say, you know what, we're going to push this case all the way to the Supreme Court, but there's no accusations, there's no charges. And that's his problem. And so he's hoping that King Agrippa will find something to write down for him to help him not look so foolish in front of Caesar. Because I'm sure it's not going to look good for him. Caesar's going to say, you know what, this man doesn't know how to govern. He can't handle this situation in this area, and we need to replace him. And so I think that's what's going on here. Any questions on chapter 25?
So, my lord, that means Caesar, or does it mean Nero?
That would have been the Caesar. I think it was Nero at this time.
It was or wasn't?
I think it was.
So he'd been the Roman emperor.
Yes. It does say Augustus back here. What verse was that? Verse 21. And they interchanged a lot of their names, so I didn't really look into that, if it was Nero or if it really is Augustus. But I think it's referring to the Caesar at that time. So
That word prom, isn't that where we get the word promenade? I would call it prom.
I think so. There is the Greek word. I can't remember what the Greek word. I didn't write it down. I think so. Yeah. Vain show. Yeah. The showy appearance. Yes.
It's funny that the graduation song that they play is called Pomp and Circumstance. That's what I went to whenever you said pomp.
Yeah. Yep. It's just a vain show, is what the word in Greek, at least in the Greek shows, or talks about. All right, anything else in chapter 25? We're kind of stopped right in the middle of the discourse here. Not really.
Ask you a weird question.
Okay, go ahead.
Were Bernice and Agrippa full brother and sister?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm reading in Genesis, and Abraham and Sarah are related closely like this, and so it was in my brain. I was like,
Yeah,
Brother and sister.
which it was his half-sister.
I know,
But
it's not much.
from what I could tell, it was their full-blood brother and sister, which things were different back during that time. Yes.
No, it was just interesting to me that it was such a scandal for them being brother and sister, but it was okay for a lot of,
Yeah, but you gotta remember, that's several thousands of years before, a couple thousand years before. So,
The Jewish law is the one that restricted that. So you have all that happen, Noah and his sons, they would have to marry their cousins and things. And so the gene pool was a lot purer back then. And so then, what's interesting to me is you have this relationship between these two, and then they're rubbing elbows with the Jews. And the Jews would have forbid that relationship, but yet it says a lot about the Jews and their mindset and the politics of the day, that they really didn't care about morality and the law and the rules. They're just using people in situations for their good.
which happened with Christ, happened with Paul several times, yeah. They would go to someone that they completely hated and act like their friend, which is what they did in first part of chapter 25. They didn't like Festus. They didn't want to be his friend, but when he went down to Jerusalem, they tried to get him on their side and make it seem like that they were helping him out. So,
You mentioned the gene pool, what if that's partially why we don't live here as long as they did back early?
yeah.
Not saying it's good to straight line, but you
It
said
still happens in the Amish community today.
yeah, but that's not beneficial, you get that out.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It wasn't,
That's right. Huh?
it wasn't beneficial back then either.
No.
Is it 800, 900 years
Not
old?
all communities did though. If you read like the Egyptians, it caused a lot of, along inbreeding, not able to reproduce and all kinds of wonky
Yeah.
defects.
Well, you get into genetics and stuff, I'm sure it was a lot different with Adam and Eve all the way through to that point. But I'm not a scientist, so I don't know all the scientific facts.
In common.
Yeah.
Today. So for their siblings, they still want to be, it'd be like a half sibling.
Yeah.
You're saying Adam and Eve?
Yep.
Yeah, that's true, I didn't think about that.
Now, you're talking about the age changed after Noah. So the environment changed. If you look at, Holly was reading about the genealogies in the Old Testament through Genesis, she was talking about the fact that how quickly it changed, because after Noah, you had people living 200 years, 300 years, and then all the way down to 100 years.
It went down quickly. It started at 500 and then it went down to like 4 and then 3 and then it was 120.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because really Abraham lived a lot longer than most during that time.
500?
That's a long time. Or 965 years. That would be crazy. But that, so it changed, which if you look at the world changed. And the world was not as conducive to people living so long after that point. Yeah, because we didn't have that greenhouse effect anymore, which is what we're all scared of, supposedly today, is the greenhouse effect. But it changed a lot. So, anything else on chapter 25? All right, I've got a handout. I didn't have this ready when I filled your guys' packets this morning. 26 is really, we're continuing on in the discourse. You know, it's a terrible chapter break because it's right in the middle of the conversation. Maybe the reason they put a chapter break here is because Festus went from speaking to Agrippa, and so there was a good place to break the chapter. But Agrippa is now going to start speaking. And so somebody want to read let's start verse 1 through verse 11. Here, let me take the extra.
Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth the hand and answered for himself. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee touching all the things whereof I am accused of the Jews, especially because I know thee to be expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews. Wherefore I beseech thee to hear me patiently. My manner of life from my youth, which was at the first among mine own nation at Jerusalem, know all the Jews, which knew me from the beginning, if they would testify that after the most straightest sect of our religion I lived a Pharisee. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers, unto which promise our 12 tribes instantly serving God day and night hope to come, for which hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused of the Jews. Why should it be thought a thing incredible with you that God should raise the dead? I barely thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus the Nazarene, which thing I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests. And when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them, and I punished them oft in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme. And being exceedingly mad against them, I persecuted them even into strange cities.
All right, so Agrippa says to Paul, verse 1, you are permitted to speak for yourself. And Paul stretches out his hand and answered for himself. Now, it's interesting as we see that Festus turned over control of this jury to Agrippa. And that kind of seems to point to the fact that Agrippa was probably higher than him. Him being a governor, King Agrippa was over him, over this area. And so that's why he did this. But it's interesting to note also, he's allowed to speak for himself, which Paul has always done. But it says, so Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. I think that's an interesting detail. Why would Luke state that he stretched out his hand? Could be the fact that he was bound. Maybe he had bindings on his hands and he was showing that he was bound. It could be it was a motioning with his hand to get everybody's attention, which I don't think is the case because he had everybody's attention because Festus was speaking, or Agrippa was speaking. But it's just an interesting detail that Luke seemed to put there. It could be. I don't know. It's just an interesting detail. It could be that as a sign of respect to Agrippa.
Well, because it starts out bragging, not bragging, but
lifting him up in a sense. Yeah, complimenting him. Yeah, he does.
I always thought of it as in opposition to him cowering in the corner. He stood up,
Mm-hmm.
spoke out.
Yeah, it could be. Just interesting detail that, Luke puts a lot of details in his writings, and I think it's interesting. He's very detailed. We get into when Paul starts to journey from Caesarea to Rome, and all the details that Luke puts in there. Luke's always done that, and so he adds this detail for a reason. But it's just neat to see his writings, and it's his style. So then verse 2, it says, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things which I'm accused of by the Jews. He says, verse 3, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently. Paul is glad to speak. And as, Kathy mentioned, he starts to brag. Not brag, but build up and lift up Agrippa for his knowledge and his understanding of the Jewish law. That's going to be a benefit to Paul. Why?
He'll be able to see right through everything that's going on.
Okay, right. He's not going to be like Festus or someone else who doesn't know the laws of the Jews. And to hear someone, here you have the accuser saying, well, he's going against the law. Paul's saying, I'm not going against the law. He's going to go, I don't know. Of course, Festus is going to trust the accusers because of who they are. And that's unfortunate for Paul. Now, Agrippa is on the other side of that. He knows the customs. He knows the law. He can make a good determination himself on what Paul has done. What is another thing that's going to be good? That he knows the law, the customs, and the prophets. Huh?
He knows Paul's not a criminal. He knows
Okay.
the things he's accused of,
Yep.
he didn't do.
Yeah, I think that's going to be important. He's going to know that Paul didn't do anything wrong.
And he knows
He's not a criminal.
He also knows that Paul did the things that Jews asked him to do in going after the Christians before he turned to
Mm-hmm.
a Christian.
Yep. Showing his zeal that he had before. Yep. And
Agrippa
seeing
would
that.
not be partial to, he's not partial to all these people that brought the charges.
I don't think he would be. Maybe he is. We don't know. I mean, we're going to see something different about Agrippa when we get to the end. Agrippa says, you've almost converted me. But that's what I'm wanting to focus on. Him knowing the law, the prophets, what else is he going to understand about what Paul talks about? He could understand the Messiah. He could understand because he knows the prophets. He knows what the prophets said about the Messiah. And so Paul, and he's going to do that. He's going to talk about Christ. He's going to use that opportunity to speak about the gospel. He's going to be able to connect the dots. He's going to say, oh yeah, I remember that prophet said that. I grew up, I heard that, I understand that. And so it's going to be good for Paul because he's going to say, well, you know what? Actually, he's not a blasphemer because he is speaking about someone that was prophesied by the prophets. So that's going to help Paul even more. And I think that's important in this situation also. With Paul doing what he's saying here and that building him up and flattering him in his knowledge, he's also showing respect. I think he's showing respect to the king. And so he says there, I beg you to hear me patiently. Paul wants him to hear what he has to say about everything. And so then verse 4, it says, my manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation of Jerusalem, all the Jews know. They knew me from the first that they were willing to testify that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. Now he says, even from my youth, I learned and I grew up. And this is nothing new. Paul has talked about this before. But I think it's interesting he brings up here. He says, these people that are accusing me knew me from my youth. They knew what he was like. They knew he understood the law. They knew he respected the law. They knew that he lived by the law for many, many years. And so he knew they were serious. And even that, think about this, some of these people were probably his friends that he grew up with that are now standing there accusing him of blasphemy and want him dead. You know, that's just a lot to think about. He states that, why he is being put on the stand in a sense. Verse 6, it says, "And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers." To this promise, and so I'm going to continue that in a minute. But it talks about this promise, and this promise is a reference to who? Who was the promise that they looked forward to for years? The Messiah. He said, I'm being judged upon the promise that they look forward to, that has come, that is here. And he's going to talk about that more. He's judged upon that promise. And so he's starting out by stating all of these things that he has done. Now, some historians or some people believe that Paul, in stating some of the things here, which we'll see another piece of evidence for that in the last part of this section, that Paul could have been a part of the Sanhedrin. And the reason is because of the closeness. They all knew him, and then we're going to see he also cast a vote to kill Christians. And so Paul could have been possibly a part of the Sanhedrin before he was converted to Christianity. And so in verse 7 it says, "To this promise our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God night and day, hope to attain. For this hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused by the Jews. Why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead?" He said this hope that they're looking for, the 12 tribes for many years earnestly served God day and night, looking forward to that promise. Now, side note, 12 tribes references the people, the Jewish faith, the people that lived from the promise that started all the way till now, references the people, the 12 tribes. Paul knew, and this is more kind of into Revelation, we talk about Revelation, but the premillennialist idea is that the 12 tribes of Israel are lost, or the 10 tribes of Israel, and that one day those tribes will come back to the land and acquire that land. Paul knew that they all came back. So it's kind of a side detail. Paul says here the 12 tribes labored day and night. He knew they came back. And so that's kind of a side note, but just your neat detail to think about when we get into the book of Revelation again. But he says here, for this hope's sake, King Agrippa, I'm accused. And so verse 8, why should it be thought incredible by you that God raised the dead? In them saying that Christ was not resurrected, that he was, as history tells us, they sent, or in Matthew chapter 28 tells us also, they put out the lie that the apostles hid Christ's body because they didn't want to believe that Christ was resurrected. By saying that Christ is not resurrected, what are they limiting in reference to God? His power. And so he is standing there saying, this is the hope that they've been looking for years, and now they're saying that God can't raise the dead. Now, that also gives us a little detail of who his accusers are. Who was the ones that believed that the resurrection could not happen? The Sadducees. Paul continues to reference the resurrection in his defenses in front of Felix, in front of Festus, and now Agrippa. That tells us that the ones that were standing there trying to see Paul dead, be put to death, were Sadducees. And that's why he keeps bringing this up. But they limit God's power by saying that there is no resurrection, by believing that Christ was not resurrected. And so he is stating he has been. And he asks Agrippa, he says, think about it. Can God do this? He can. Verse 9.
Was it them that paid off? The Sadducees, were they the ones that paid off the guard? Who paid off the guards who said,
That was just the Jews in general. Back to 28.
I guess my point is if they paid him off, then they knew that he was, you see what I'm saying? Like,
They did.
They paid him off.
They didn't want anybody else to believe
They didn't want anybody to believe
So they,
it.
well, people should believe it.
That's right.
One just, you know, that's kind of funny.
It makes no sense, does it?
We're gonna pay you off because we don't know what happened, but probably you rose from the dead because we're paying you off.
Not chapter 28. Well, and the thing is, you think about it, a person that has a hardened heart, they're not going to see and connect the dots. And their hearts were hardened. They did not want to believe Christ was the Messiah. So even though they knew he was gone and he was raised, they're going to try to hide it because they're scared of losing their power and they want to deny it. So it's sad. But that's exactly what they're doing. And so, someone read Romans chapter 1, verse 1 through 4.
Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness, by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord.
Okay, so they're denying, really this is the gospel. They're denying the gospel. They're denying the power of God. And then, of course, Romans 1 and verse 16, Paul says that the gospel is powerful. And so by saying that God has not raised up Christ, or is limiting God's power, limiting the power of the gospel. And so they're just trying to hide it. They're trying to deny it. And so that brings us to verse 9, which we're out of time. So we'll pick up here next week, verse 9, and continue on. And we get some more detail in what, each time Paul recounts what happened to him in Acts chapter 9, we get more details of what's going on. So it's just interesting. All right, thank you guys for your time.